They lie in silence, cities within cities, where a tomb is a home, where a fire isn't cheery, where your name is sandblasted into stone, and your transportation is one way. Let us be your guide to a land you will someday enter and never leave. Now, Cemeteries on Modern Marvels. Since the first man walked the earth, more than 100 billion people have been born. And although we mortal souls live longer than ever before, inevitably, we wind up in places like these, with only ghosts and worms for friends. No fewer than 2 million people die in the United States each year. And that makes dealing with our dead a $20 billion industry. America witnesses approximately 5,500 burials a day. Most of us will kick back in caskets. About 25% of the dead will have their corporeal form incinerated. Others take a more exotic journey into the next world, including launching one's remains into space. But most corpses take up residence in those cities of the dead we call cemeteries.
Well, they're called cities of the dead for the most immediate reason is that they resemble small-scale cities, particularly if you look at an aerial view of them.
We plan them carefully. We have business in them. We have deviance that occurs in them. They, in some sense, are both these sacred realms that are outside of our daily routine lives, and at the same time, they are reflections of those, and part of those, and in some sense, shape those.
Above ground, the human history of cemeteries is made of stone and sings of eternity. But beneath, that history is made of flesh forever altered by the insidious process of decomposition. In as little as 10 years, the skin of the corpse begins to loosen and sag, turning to liquid and toxic gas, or in extreme conditions, drying to a mummified mask. The bones, even in a well-made casket, remain whole only for a few hundred years. Nonetheless, it's comforting to think of death as peaceful slumber and cemeteries as pleasant places, where a single soul may be glorified or millions speak in a single voice. At the dawn of history, the dead were left to rot or were devoured by vultures. Later, traditions developed in which heavy stones were placed on the corpse, not only by way of marking the grave, but also to prevent the dead from rising to walk among the living. Superstitious people feared that the dead might not stay that way.
Someone who was ill would be put in a cave, and rocks would be put in front of the cave so that if they got well, they could move the rocks, but in some cases they didn't, and they became early tombs.
As early as 50,000 BC, Neanderthals dug graves and scattered broken bones as offerings. There is evidence they marked their burial places with flowers. In 3200 BC, the Egyptians developed the art of embalming to ensure their royals could contact the beyond. According to the historian Herodotus, the Egyptian embalming method required 80 days, First, the corpse's brain was pulled out through his nose. Then, the corpse was soaked in brine for 30 days. After drying out, the desiccated body was placed in a wooden coffin, surrounded by a stone sarcophagus. For their trouble, Egyptian embalmers produced a rather off-putting result. Blackened, dry skin stretched tightly over a chemically tanned body. But they believed such a body would attract the psychic double, the astral being who would lead the deceased to the everlasting. By 800 BC, cremation was the most common method of body disposal in Greece. The Greeks coined the word koimeterion, or sleeping place, from which the word cemetery is derived. In 600 BC, the cremation tradition spread to the Roman Empire.
One reason that the Romans embraced cremation was hygienic concerns, that the cities themselves were so lacking in hygiene that they feared the contamination that was associated with the decomposing body.
In 400 AD, however, cremation's flames were dampened. Christianity was on the rise, and Emperor Constantine declared burning the dead to be pagan. The alternative, earth burial, had deep significance for early Christians. Their churches were built over tombs of martyrs. In Rome, for example, St. Peter is buried beneath an altar, bearing his name. The rich and powerful arranged to be buried in consecrated ground, inside the church. Christians believed that such a burial meant the body would rise again come Judgment Day. Those who couldn't afford a proper burial ended up in mass graves, in potters' fields. The term came about because the first field so used may have belonged to a potter.
To be buried in the church is to be as close to God, as close to that magical relationship between human and God as possible. Very quickly, of course, the church becomes overcrowded with burials, and it becomes impossible to satisfy all the claims on that space.
In 1374, a dark cloud appeared over Europe, the Black Plague. Carried by rodents infected with a deadly virus, the plague brought death to millions within just 18 months. As cemeteries spilled over with bodies and bones, horrified eyewitnesses reported on the end stage of the disease.
Those infected felt themselves penetrated by a pain throughout their whole bodies. Then vomiting of blood continued without intermission for 3 days, there being no means of healing it. And then the patient expired.
As the plague spread, churches were clogged with the dead, who were stacked up like cordwood. There was no choice but to move cemeteries out of the church and into the churchyard. When space grew precious there in the 18th century, cemeteries moved beyond church property. The dead had little rest in Europe. Burial and crypt facilities there were rented, not owned. That meant last year's bodies were cleared out, ground to dust, and new terminal tenants took their place.
In many European cemeteries, even today, you pay a fee for a specific period of time. That period of time can be 20 years, it can be 100 years.
In the 1780s, authorities in Paris even built an underground boneyard called the catacombs. But as the numbers of the dead grew, the city fathers had no choice but to give them more space. Père Lachaise Cemetery, established over 200 years ago, still offers permanent burial within its spacious walls. In frontier America, cemeteries were not yet as developed as their European counterparts. Even the grave markers were rough-hewn hand-lettered notices, speaking of violent ends, mass murders, and lynchings. Unlike in Europe, space in American cemeteries was never rented. You could decay at your own leisure. But as cemeteries inevitably filled up, the dead in America began to take up valuable real estate that the living felt belonged to them.
The problem was that the churches of New York City, or the churches of Boston, or the churches of Philadelphia had been in the center of town, and they could no longer fit more people into their graveyards.
In 1831, Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Massachusetts, was at the leading edge of the new cemetery movement in America. The goal, soon echoed in Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery in 1838, was to move the cemetery out of the city and also make cemeteries attractive places that mourners would want to visit.
The time period when cemeteries really became tourist attractions dates from the 1830s, when they created the first of these very large and beautifully landscaped cemeteries on the outskirts of major cities. They actually served the function of city parks before city parks existed.
In the 19th century, often because of poor medical knowledge, people who had fallen into a coma were believed dead and buried prematurely. In his short story, The Premature Burial, American Gothic writer Edgar Allan Poe mentions a device that was common at the time. It had a large bell mounted inside the tomb, with a rope for the mistakenly buried to tug on, frantically. The grave signal, patented by Albert Fearnought in 1882, enjoyed brisk sales among those who worried about going before their time. Next, when your time comes, you might be needing one of these. A place to enjoy your dreamless sleep. More caskets are made here than anywhere else. Each day, 1,000 roll off the line. Ever since Dracula emerged from his coffin, the box in which we place the dead has achieved iconic power. From the time of the pharaohs, the design of a coffin was anthropoidal, or shaped to accommodate the human body. Like a fine suit, it was generally custom-made, fashioned wide at the shoulders and narrow at the feet. Yankee ingenuity changed all that. In 19th century America, coffins became rectangular. They were easier to mass produce. As the coffin evolved, its name changed. American funeral directors thought that casket, derived from a French word meaning a box for precious things, could soften death's sting. As the shape changed, so did the materials. First stone and wood, then lead became popular for its permanence. In 1848, the Fisk Company patented a streamlined steel model for the Voyager into the next world and advertised it as airtight. Preservation of the corpse became an obsession in 1940, when the sealed protective coffin was perfected. The idea was to protect your loved one from flesh-eating vermin and agents of decay. As metal became the casket material of choice, the box in which we lay dead soon became something like a car, an object of transit, made on an assembly line.
In Batesville, Indiana, we produce roughly 1,000 caskets per day, or one every 55 seconds, 5 days a week, on 2 shifts. In terms of our size, we are the largest in the world.
These sheets of metal represent the beginning for 1,000 caskets daily rolling off the line at the Batesville Casket Company.
When we look at the automotive industry and how it parallels to our products, We have very similar processes. The first is we do heavy-duty stamping with large presses that create deep draws, very similar to how an auto manufacturer might produce an auto body, a fender or hood, a trunk, those types of things.
Once the raw metal is stamped into shape, workers apply welds, often aided by computer-controlled mechanical welders. A double weld can be applied simultaneously to the top and the bottom of the casket. Water flows to cool the metal, and the worker manipulates the casket in a rotating jig, so the weld properly extends to the corner. To identify it during assembly, each casket is bar-coded, so that a central computer can track its progress. Each unit is vacuum tested to ensure the integrity of the seal between the top and the bottom. A feature of the Batesville product line is the monoseal, a gasket around the lip of the casket. It stops grave elements like dirt and moisture from entering, but allows gases, the natural product of decomposition, to escape. This inhibits a pressure buildup that could force the casket to pop open. The corpse gases, referred to as mephitic gases, include methane and hydrogen sulfide, with its characteristic rotten egg smell. The automotive metaphor rolls on down the Batesville assembly line as paint is applied, often in the same colors that are popular on Detroit's finest.
When you saw hunter green cars coming into play, hunter green caskets became, shortly thereafter, a fairly popular item. So as the culture of automotive and consumer culture of color comes in, it also then flows into our business.
Moving from the outside of the casket to the interior, Batesville does its own embroidery on the cloth liner of the casket lid and has more than 10,000 standard designs available, and no limit to the custom designs. Controlled by a computer which sets up the designs, embroidery machines knock out basic floral designs in about 35 minutes, while a military emblem on a higher-end machine requires more than 2 hours to finish. Speed is important because once most families make a decision on casket design, they expect the finished product to arrive at the funeral home within 24 hours.
Literally, if they called today and said, I would like this product delivered tomorrow, they would identify what they wanted engraved on the casket. That would be sent to one of our rapid deployment centers. This evening, it would go out to a service center that we have, and from there be delivered to the customer tomorrow morning.
Not only does Batesville make more caskets than any other manufacturer, they also make some of the most expensive burial containers available, with sleek polished metal and gold fittings, like the Millennium model.
The Millennium will go anywhere from $7,500 to $12,000, depending on individual funeral director prices. They're designed around simplicity, but true elegance. And there's a percentage of the population that has a high appeal to.
We live in a society where I can't afford to spend $75,000 on a car. I can't afford to spend $45 million on a house. These are choices that people make. And again, we come back to, if this is someone who was the world to you, and you have bought them a $45 million house and you've bought them a $75,000 car, why is it surprises if you're going to spend that kind of money on their burial?
The visual appeal of a box meant to spend eternity under the dirt may seem a paradox to some. But a gravestone is a different matter. Exposed above ground for all to see, your marker says a lot about you even as you decompose. It wasn't always so. Early markers were simple wooden crosses, the cross being a sign of death even before it was a Christian symbol. The individual stone marker placed over a grave is a recent development, only about 300 years old. But the method of making stone markers hasn't changed much over the centuries. A hammer and chisel were the tools required. In 18th century America, gravestones made of granite depicted familiar images of death.
There are symbols that at certain times in history reflect the things that are important to people during that time period. If you go back to the earliest cemeteries in the United States, those that are found in colonial New England, and especially those from the Puritan period, you find a dense concentration of mortality symbols.
Today, grave markers have become more expressive of the individual. At Quering Monument Company in Seattle, Washington, they make 18,000 monuments a year, many of them custom designs. Such production would not be possible without the computer.
The computer gives us a lot of choices. In other words, cut more intricate, more detailed designs with more variety. And as we get more unique in our hobbies, in our vocations, in our lives, why we require more unique and specialized ways to memorialize.
Consider a Datsun 280Z depicted in granite. One of the many images of work and play graphic artists add to grave markers. Designs go to a computer-controlled electric plotter that scores the design into a rubber stencil. A technician glues the stencil to the stone. Then the marker is placed in a protective enclosure and sandblasted. The sand, made of a synthetic substance called zirconia, which rivals a diamond for durability, removes unwanted areas, while the rubber sheet protects the polished stone beneath. When the final bits of rubber are peeled away, the finished design emerges.
You know, my father, when he started in the business in 1925 working for his uncle, he started as a chisel sharpener. When they were working on marble, those guys could use a chisel about every 10 minutes. Now we can use dry diamond wheels to cut granite, to polish it. All that equipment now is computerized, and while it's very expensive, the cost per square foot to polish is lower than it's ever been.
A statue that may have taken a year to complete with the old tools can go from sketch to cemetery in 3 months. Next, if you're rich enough, you don't have to rely solely upon your grave marker to say who you are. You can build a mansion in the cemetery, a house to die for. If you want to go out with a song, the place to be buried in America is New Orleans. In the traditional jazz funerals still popular today, music and a sense of celebration send the dead to rest with a swinging beat. There are more cemeteries and more burial methods here than anywhere else. Common in New Orleans, but unique elsewhere, is above-ground burial.
New Orleans above-ground burial happened for 2 reasons historically. One is cultural. It is an ancient Mediterranean tradition. However, there was a more immediate reason that people began to use above-ground tombs, and that is geology. The water table here is very high, and much of New Orleans itself is below sea level. Imagine what would happen to a wooden buoyant casket which is forced below the ground. When the water table rises, they would get pushed back up above the ground.
In 19th century New Orleans, yellow fever epidemics produced an explosion of death. Mosquitoes rose from murky cisterns to suck the blood of the innocent and spread contagion. City cemeteries were flooded with cadavers, and newspapers published frightful accounts.
At the gates, the winds brought intimation of the corruption working within. Not a puff was not laden with the rank atmosphere from rotting corpses. Inside, they were piled by 50s, exposed to the heat of the sun, swollen with corruption, bursting their coffin lids. What a feast of horrors.
In those days, bodies were not embalmed with preservatives, such as formaldehyde. This had, believe it or not, several positive aspects. The hot weather and busy insects of New Orleans helped dead bodies decompose. Flesh could begin to rot away in little more than a week. In this environment, the cemetery walls could cleverly serve two purposes: enclosing the cemetery and also packaging the deceased.
They're called wall vaults for obvious reasons. They act as the walls of the cemeteries. And they're also known as oven vaults for a couple of reasons, in that, well, one, some of the old vaults are in a barrel vault shape and they resemble old brick baker's ovens. Also, they act like ovens. One of the reasons that the city's been able to get away with above ground burial and the common repeat use of tombs is that the bodies break down more rapidly.
After the traditional interval of a year and a day, the origins of the tradition are not clear. An old body may be removed from a crypt to make room for a fresh corpse.
You throw the casket away, then you take the human remains and you put them in a bag and you put them back in the vault and you push them to the back or to the side. You basically make room somehow and you put the next casket in there. So if you see 15 or 20 or 30 names on an inscription tablet, the remains of all those people will break down together in the recesses of the wall vaults.
Association crypts built by immigrant or labor groups maximize the use of space by interring dozens of bodies in a single place.
If you take the Italian Society tomb, for example, there are 24 vaults on that tomb. Now you have 24 vaults, and you have this year and a day period of time, historically. So if you do the math on that, 24 vaults in a year and a day means that conceivably, within 1 century, you could entomb 2,400 people in that society tomb. Now, of course, it never would have been that many, but maybe 1,000 wouldn't be out of the question. So that gives you an idea of how efficient the use of space is, as opposed to one person per casket horizontally below the ground forever.
In 1872, New Orleans cemeteries were filling up fast because Civil War casualties had strained city resources. At the same time, an economic downturn left a local racetrack idle. In the spirit of convenience and efficiency, the racetrack was converted into a city of the dead. Today, Metairie Cemetery retains its distinctive racetrack oval shape. Run by a corporation, its rows of crypts and tombs are vast enough to require street signs. Angels, sphinxes, and even dogs stare with sightless eyes at those paying their respects. Tombs like these on Millionaires' Row can cost more than $700,000. Some are empty, built in advance by their rich owners who have planned ahead for their own demise. In the late 1860s, the Egan family recreated their ancestral Scottish castle in Metairie Cemetery, complete with a ruined effect to illustrate the ravages of time.
It's very interesting because it may appear to be damaged, but they actually went to a lot of trouble to replicate the decay there, which I think is a real New Orleans sensibility, almost have this controlled sense of decay.
And the Brunswick family monument is known worldwide as an example of the Egyptian revival style. Next, while cemeteries can be deathly still, the sound and fury required to build a hearse is enough to wake the dead. For centuries, the dignity of the funeral procession was choreographed with the squeak of wagon wheels and the clop of horses' hooves. Civilians rode to the cemetery in wagons enclosed by carved wooden panels. or sometimes with glass to show off the coffin. From the time of the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, soldiers who died in battle were carried to their final resting place in a caisson, a wagon designed to carry ammunition. When General John Pershing, the leader of the United States Expeditionary Forces in World War I, died in 1948, his funeral procession featured the traditional caisson covered with an American flag. When the first motorized hearses began to appear in the United States and England, they cost as much as $6,000, at a time when a horse-drawn hearse could be had for $1,500. But forward-looking funeral directors found that the faster-moving motorized hearse paid for itself because it could handle more funerals in less time. But it wasn't until the early 1920s that the automobile was considered dignified enough for a funeral procession. For the 1938 model year, a company called Sayers & Scoville introduced the industry's first landau, or Victoria-style hearse. Its roof was decorated by S-shaped irons, inspired by those used to lower the tops on horse-drawn carriages. The S-shaped iron decoration remains on hearses to this day. At the Crystal Car Company in Brea, California, a hearse is still a handcrafted affair. Each day, only 5 are made. The death rate can't justify a production model hearse. After all, each of us only requires one ride, so an existing car must be modified. It starts when a new Cadillac or Lincoln is sliced like a cantaloupe with a high-speed saw. After the luxury car is bisected, a fiberglass shell is placed on top and sealed, sanded, and finished. After painting, the electrical system, removed so that the vehicle could be stretched, must be replaced by hand, wire by wire. The finishing touches include a bed complete with rollers for easy casket removal, the basic design of which hasn't changed in more than 50 years. And the cost? $60,225, not including flowers. The completed vehicle might be one of those that enter one of the forest lawn chain of memorial parks, where there are 10,000 funerals a year. With its famous statuary, including an exact replica of Michelangelo's David, the original forest lawn can resemble a Southern California theme park. But few other theme parks are so quiet, and none of them make their own burial vaults. Forest Lawn, one of the few cemeteries to fashion vaults on site, makes as many as 24 a day. And their purpose is to prevent the ground over the grave from settling, in order to maintain a perfect lawn. Many modern cemeteries use similar vaults. The vaults are formed from 2 L-shaped molds that fit together snugly. Once cast, the vault is sealed and painted, and shipped out to one of the 5 forest lawn properties. Hubert Eaton, the builder whose creed guided the creation of Forest Lawn, felt that cemeteries should be places of life, and they shouldn't be called cemeteries. He wanted them known as memorial parks.
He set out to basically design a cemetery for the living, a place for people to come, and a place to secure or care for the memories, as opposed to just a repository. So it really is a different way of looking at a cemetery.
It's much sleeker, it's much more accessible. Forest lawn shifts the landscape from this enveloping, picturesque sense where you're very close contact with death to one where you have open vistas. It's still a natural landscape, but it's a controlled, in aesthetic words, beautiful landscape.
At Forest Lawn, computer-assisted designs deliver the appropriate crypts, graves, and tombs. Graves are dug in advance, and a cement vault set in place. Then the hole is filled and covered with fresh green sod, ready for its future occupant.
When we start with a master plan, we define the boundaries and we define the types of properties that are needed in order to maintain our inventory, which is obviously driven on by demand.
The vault weighs 700 pounds. Forest Lawn engineers custom designed a vault carrier to lower it into place. Then, as has been customary for centuries, human muscle, aided by a winch, is required to lower the casket into the ground. Today, ground burial is the most popular method of body disposal. But an age-old alternative is making a comeback. Next, it's the hottest place in town, about 1800 degrees, the crematory. Varanasi is India's city of the dead. Situated on the northern bank of the Ganges River, the city features 100 ghats, or steps. Many are used for bathing in the sacred waters. But one of the oldest is for burning. Cremation on a pyre of burning wood is said to free the soul from the cycle of reincarnation. Each month, hundreds of corpses are disposed of here, literally requiring boatloads of wood to fuel fires. Cremation was also a tradition of the Vikings, who through the 8th and 11th centuries set their most venerated dead to sea aboard burning ships. The Greek tradition of cremation called for placing the remains in box-shaped vessels. As cremation migrated from India to America, it traveled indoors for health reasons, into sealed cremation chambers. In 1876, a retired physician named Francis Julius Lemoyne lit the first crematory in America. But actually, Dr. Lemoyne was not the first to go in his device. The body of a local baron was pressed into service by enthusiastic cremation advocates who wanted to show a doubting public that cremation was a sanitary way to dispose of bodies. Faced with zinc, topped with corrugated iron, Dr. Lemoyne's crematory cost $1,500 to build. By 1900, 20 crematories were glowing in 7 American cities. In 1913, there were 52 crematories in North America, and over 10,000 cremations took place in that year. Today, cremations are performed in computer-controlled chambers. The procedure takes place inside a casket-shaped container made of particle board that is rigid, combustible, and leak-proof. After the container is loaded in and the door sealed, a series of computer-controlled burners are activated. The heat inside the chamber must reach as high as 1,800 degrees to consume a corpse over a period of 1.5 hours. The main burner aims a column of flame directly at the chest cavity. This part of the body contains the most fat and burns most efficiently. Later in the process, an afterburner kicks in to ensure that any particulate matter is burned completely before it is expelled into the air.
When I started in the cremation profession, a crematory had 4 buttons: stop, start, open, and close. You can see today that the crematories have come a long way. The dials and the gadgets you see today are electronically controlled. They're computer generated. You have different gauges that will be able to start the crematory, determine the amount of time the cremation process will take place, the amount of air that will be used during the combustion process, the air mixed with the gas, and be able to determine if particulates are going into the stack. There is a gauge that will be able to adjust the amount of burn to eliminate any emissions through the crematory itself.
Families who want to see their loved ones off can watch the cremation from an observation room.
With the multicultural changes in the United States, with religions wanting to be able to be part of the cremation process, and with family members wanting to be part of the closure, a room like this, crematories built such as this, are becoming more popular.
Indians often have their firstborn son push the button, echoing the tradition of the funeral pyre in India. The end result of cremation is not ashes, as is commonly believed, but bone fragments. Depending upon the size of the body, from 3 to 9 pounds of these fragments remain to be placed in the cremation urn or box. Of course, once the cremation remains are placed in an urn, they may be cast to sea or even sent aloft. A company called Celestis offers to shoot about 8 ounces of one's remains into space. Psychologist and LSD advocate Timothy Leary and Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry have taken that long, strange trip. The cost is $5,300, about the price of the average funeral. Placing the ashes in lunar orbit costs more, about $13,000. Cemeteries have changed throughout history to reflect the inner desires of humans as well as the practical matters of disposing of millions of bodies. While burial rituals of the past were standardized, today, people expect a more personal, more individualized approach. And technology seems able to deliver the needed image, container, or transport. No matter what changes lie in store for the cemetery of the future, death will remain a healthy business, with millions of new customers each year.